Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I've been wanting to do a episode on the topic we're going to get into in a second for a really long time. I went down a deep rabbit hole in all of this stuff a while ago, and yes, I'm being coy about what the topic is, although you probably can tell from the title of the show. And then I kind of forgot it because lots of things have been going on, and I kind of put it on a back burner. And then about a month ago, something like that, someone tweeted one of my dog tweets and said, "Look, I don't know the guy, but Jonah Goldberg's Twitter account may be the least mimetic account on Twitter, and because all he does is share his opinions and tweet pictures of his dogs." And I took it as a compliment. And and I went and looked at the bio of the dude who did it. It turns out he wrote a book called Wanting the Power of Mimetic Desire. And I've wanted to do a show about René Girard and mimetic theory for a long time. People might recall I've brought it up a few times. And I was like, I asked my assistant, go check out if this guy can talk. And she looked up some stuff and found out he could talk and found out he's like a normal human being and professor at Catholic University of Business. And so I don't know Luke, but Luke Burgis, I'm delighted that you took me up on my offer to come on the Remnant, and we're just going to have a conversation. Thanks for
having me on. I appreciate it. Yeah, sometimes tweets can lead to some really good things, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, just the law of large numbers would dictate as much, right?
Right.
For every trillion tweets, an angel gets its wings. So why don't we just sort of begin at the beginning? This is, I told you I want to do this sort of like a Girard Mimetics 101 thing for listeners who don't know anything about it. I know just enough about all this stuff to know I don't know very much about it. But I know the areas where I don't know things about. So why don't we just sort of start from the beginning and just like, what is it? And who was René Girard? Why does he matter? You know, doesn't have either a very slow elevator pitch explanation or maybe a short plane ride kind of conversation. However you want to do it, just sort of set it up.
Sure. Well, let me just say who René Girard was first. He was a French academic born in 1923 in France and came to the U.S. shortly after World War II, bounced around to a lot of different universities and landed at Stanford in 1981. And he was there for about the last 35 years of his life. Died in 2015. And he had a lot of proteges and people that he taught at Stanford, probably for better or worse, most famously Peter Thiel, who has popularized his ideas in a major way. But he didn't live that exciting of a life. It was all inside of his mind. But his core idea, and I'm going to give you a broad lay of the land of all of mimetic theory, because there's a lot there. It's a broad, sweeping theory of human behavior. And it's a psychological theory of human behavior. And there's so many, this is why I think he's important. I think so many problems that we're experiencing in our country are psychological, I would even say spiritual. They can't necessarily be solved with political solutions alone or policy solutions. And Girard is talking about human psychology and behavior. And his fundamental idea is that contrary to this Rousseauian romantic lie, and Girard himself called it the romantic lie, that human desires are a product of our independent, autonomous selves. They just rise up out of nowhere, and we want things independently. In fact, humans are social creatures, and we catch our desires, and our desires are formed in relationship with other people. So mimetic means imitative. Simply means that we imitate the desires of other people, which means that humans naturally are rivalrous beings. We're constantly looking to other people to understand what to want. And the more abstract the thing is, the more we rely on other people to use as models or mediators of our desires. And this, to make it really simple, we go back to 2001 Space Odyssey. If you remember the opening scene, the dawn of man, right? There's these two tribes of apes, and there's a little watering hole, and there's only one watering hole. And it's sort of the dawn of violence, and they fight over this one watering hole. So you might wonder, well, what happens? We don't live in that world anymore. For the first time in history, we live in a world where many people are struggling with abundance. Many Americans, at least, are struggling with abundance. So do we still live in a world where we're fighting over scarce resources? Girard turns that kind of fundamental question on its head, and he says that, well, in this world that we live in, the scarcity is often a product of the mimesis. Like we want something because somebody else wants it, which makes us rivals with them, which makes the thing scarce because only one of us can have it. And that's why we fight. So the first part of Girard's theory is just the fundamental recognition that we are mimetic creatures. We want what other people want, and that can pull us in rivalry with them and create naturally leads to conflict and to violence. The second and the third part of his theory is how that mimetic desire leads us into conflict and into rivalry and violence with other people. And in Girard's view, and we can get to this at some point in the conversation if you want to go there, this is why humans formed institutions, why we have laws, why we have taboos against things like incest. These were products of this fundamental, we could call it a primordial rivalry and a primordial violence. And these things sprung up to prevent those things from happening. So he has a relatively dark view of human nature. Sort of left to our own devices, we will naturally enter into rivalries with other people, even if resources are not scarce, because we are deriving what we want from those people, which, if you stop to think about it, very naturally leads us into conflict and rivalry. We start to view them as our enemy, even if the resources aren't scarce.
Okay, so a lot to sort of unpack here, and I want to do justice to the listeners who don't know any of this stuff, and I so far I know this part. If I were a well-educated normie who had never heard of René Girard mimetic theory, and I just listened to that, I would say, okay, so this guy's like an evolutionary psychologist, right? Because there's a lot of stuff in evolutionary psychology that covers the same ground. Or I might say, okay, so he's he's an economist. Thorsten Veblen and conspicuous consumption, or I think the one that's really on point and the thing I've written about the most in just relation to this is Fred Hirsch and his concept of the positional good, right? I call it dog economics. In the dog park, there are many sticks, but all the dogs want the stick that the dog carrying the stick and running with it has, right? And in Girard, you correct me if I'm wrong, one of the original narratives is Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel were not economically all that different, right? One's like a farmer and the other one's like a herder or whatever. What they were jealous of was being God's favorite. And only one, that's the positional good. Only one can be the favorite, right? So I get that what you left out in that, and I'm sure you have an answer for it, is the way you would describe it. Or first of all, let me just say, anyone who says the romantic lie and pees on Rousseau from a great height is I have sympathy for. But the way you put it, you make it sound like this is all on an individual basis. And where an evolutionary psychologist would disagree is he would say, no, we don't individually become adversarial. We form little groups and bands and troops and tribes and compete with each other on that level, because the coalition instinct says there's strength in numbers. And even with the apes in that 2001 thing, it wasn't one ape on one ape action. It was one band on another band kind of action. So where does the idea of people forming tribes or groups fit into all of this?
I would say that Girard is the anti-individualist. I mean, his great collaborator, who he wrote his magnum opus, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World with, Jean-Michel Ergoulian, coined the term interdividual. He was a psychologist, and he said, look, I can't treat an individual. I can't understand some guy who's, ruining his marriage, who comes here to me and wants me to fix his problems without understanding the system that he comes from. And the interdividual psychology is the phrase that he coined, of that family system. So Girard sort of thought that individualism, as the modern conception of it, was a lie, and that we actually can't understand human behavior without understanding it in this interdividual sense. So the tribal stuff is absolutely part of Girard. I think of the crowd looking at the crowd to understand what the crowd thinks to form a judgment about something, right? It's like the presidential debate, which just happened last week, right? Everybody's afraid to say what they think about it until they understand what everybody else first thought about it. So we're constantly looking to other people as a mirror to validate our opinions, but even our desires, right? So Girard's focus was our desires. So if I want something that nobody else wants, somehow not validated for me, and it might not be as valuable to me. So that's, it's a deeply tribal behavior, because his very claim is that we don't want anything individually. Now, there are exceptions to that. He would say that there are certain things. I'm dying of thirst in the desert, or I'm hungry. I don't need a model of desire to help me know that I want to eat a steak or that I want water. I don't need models for those things. But when it comes to more abstract and status-driven things, we don't have any internal mechanisms by which we can choose those objects. I didn't wake up in the morning one day a couple of years ago and decide independently that I want to start a Substack newsletter. Somehow that was modeled to me by other people. So it is absolutely not an individualist theory by any means.
And so let's get into that a little bit more insofar as the how to put this, the way the mimetic desire operates is it's very much the logic of high school, right? It's you want to be you want the high status position, right? You want to be with the cool group, and if you can't be in the cool group, you then signal ways that you reject the rules of the cool group. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that we Girard, as I'm paraphrasing here, but we all have two fundamental drives. One drive is the drive to be together or to belong, and we simultaneously have a drive to be differentiated. And those two drives somehow operate together. So you have this very weird dynamic where we want people to imitate us because it's somehow a sign of status. It's flattering, but not too much. Right? We don't want them to be exactly like us because that is threatening. So Girard's fundamental premise is that sameness is dangerous to us. And he notes that almost every culture in the world has some myth of sibling rivalry. Like Cain and Abel, you named one in the Bible. They have a myth of sibling rivalry, usually identical twins, Romulus and Remus in ancient Rome. It's like, why is that? Right? What's the truth there? And the truth is that that kind of mimetic rivalry with those siblings always led to conflict and violence. And what did Cain do? Cain went and founded the first city, which is, in Girard's view, is symbolic of building up these institutions that somehow prevent further violence, at least control it in some way. So the idea that sameness is a really fundamental theme in Girard, and we play this intricate dance with each other of imitating other people through mimetic desire, usually unconsciously, without knowing that we're doing it. So somehow wanting to be like other people, yet also wanting to be different at the same time. So you have this very weird dynamic where we're taking desires from other people, they're modeling behavior to us, but we also want to be different. And those two, that tension fundamentally is at the heart of human behavior.
So is it right that under Girard's view of the world, that authenticity is essentially a myth? And what's the difference, in your opinion or in his opinion, between authenticity and identity? I mean, are they just synonyms, or is there something else going on there?
The short answer is, yeah, the way that the word authenticity is typically used, he would say, is a lie, right? That is that is the romantic lie. I mean, am I the author of my own desires? Girard would firmly say no to that. We live in a world where if I want something, I don't examine it. I just assume that it's my authentic self, right? This is kind of the modern romantic lie. And Girard would say, look deeper, dude, because that has been modeled to you by somebody or someone. And because we like to think that it's completely our own, we kind of want to impose our will on anybody that says that we shouldn't pursue that desire to the end. And how do we live in a society where everybody thinks that their desire and what they want is the most important thing? So this is why I think, Girard's ideas are important, to politics or to social organization. How do we live in a world where people want different things? What kind of systems and institutions do we build up around those, where people believe the romantic lie, where they believe that myth that my desire is authentic, and anybody that says that, perhaps that desire will lead to violence, perhaps, there should be limits to how I exercise that desire. Perhaps that desire will lead me to misery and depression and unhappiness, right? Where the romantic lie is that if all of my desires are authentic and true and good, then I should be able to do whatever I want with them.
Right. And they can't steer me wrong. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
They can't steer me wrong. Exactly.
So this is, longtime listeners will know this is a huge peeve of mine. I wrote about it a lot in my last book, is that this Rousseauian notion that the highest source of moral good is within you, that, be true to yourself, listen to your gut, stay, go with your instincts, that kind of thing, is really a form of corruption. And the way I always illustrate it is literally the worst form of parenting possible. Anyone who, no good parent says, hey, look, I get it. You have to be true to yourself. You have to go with your gut, follow, listen to your feelings. I personally wouldn't run with scissors, but you have to be true to yourself. So you just take off, right? Or you eat that lead paint chip because, you feel like you gotta, right? The whole point of parenting is to prevent your kids from doing stuff that they thought was a good idea at the time, from playing with matches to, running around on the roof or whatever. And in childhood, our desires are, we're slaves to our desires a lot of the time when we're children. And the whole point of civilizing children, of educating children, is teaching them to keep their impulses in check and not listen to all of their desires at any given moment. And it feels like a lot of modern ideology these days, or modern culture, basically wants to keep children way into adulthood by saying, follow your impulses, go with your gut. No external source of morality or behavior is legitimate if it conflicts with who you are deep inside.
Yeah, and we treat adults the same way. If I was to wake up tomorrow morning after watching the Kardashians or some movie tonight, and I decided I wanted to leave my wife first thing when I woke up in the morning, if I had bad friends, they would say, "Oh, Luke, great, you're finally liberating yourself from the shackles of marriage, and good for you. You're following your authentic desires." Well, if I had good friends, they would tell me I'm being selfish and an idiot.
Right.
Right. So, but we treat adults the same way, where it's like if I express that I want something, people just automatically baptize that as good in some expression of how I'm going to ultimately be happy.
Yeah. How mad can you get at Hannibal Lecter? Because he really did want to eat people.
Exactly.
He was just being true to himself. All right. So we'll get out of the Girard stuff in just a little bit, but where does he come? Where does forgiveness and scapegoating come into this? Just so people can do the 101 part a little bit more.
Forgiveness is, I think, Girard, as he was a Christian, I should add, and saw forgiveness as the only way out of these cycles of violence that we're in as humans. The end, he wrote a book called The Scapegoat, and I'm going to backstep and explain what he means by scapegoat. But he wrote a book called The Scapegoat, and I think the very last line in that book is, "We must forgive each other, time is running out." The very last line in the whole book.
Mhm.
So it played a fundamental role. My introduction to René Girard was through the gospel story of the woman caught in adultery. I was on a retreat, and I had an old Jesuit priest recommend that I read Girard to understand what's happening in that story. And for those that don't know, there's a woman who is caught in adultery. The law of Moses prescribes that she be stoned. And there's a mob of people who have rocks in their hands that are on the verge of stoning her. And Girard would say that stoning is a violent mimetic process.
Mhm.
He asked the question, why is the first stone the hardest stone to throw? Why is that phrase, he who's without sin cast the first stone? Why is that embedded in our cultural consciousness? Well, the first stone is the hardest stone to throw because it's the only one without a model. The second stone has one model, the third stone has two, and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. And it gets easier and easier to throw the stones, right? The more you throw. I mean, get into cancel culture, but I mean, this is the foundation of it all, is that it is a mimetic process. And by the time you get to the 100th stone, it's very easy to throw, because 99 have been thrown first and might not even be alive anymore. That mimetic process in that story was subverted through the anti-mimetic act of Jesus stepping in and putting a halt to that mimetic process and making them reflect on and realize that they themselves were part of that mimetic process, right? And then it completely subverted it. And I think I referred to your account as the most anti-mimetic account on Twitter, not the least mimetic, right?
Oh,
Very
I'm sorry. Yeah,
anti-mimetic
I
account.
butchered that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
very same thing, very similar. But so that was that anti-mimetic act. And I mean, if you think about it, this kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, um, that is a mimetic reaction, right? This reactionary mindset of they do this to me, I need to do that back to them. It never quite works out as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It usually works out to be two eyes for one eye and two teeth for one tooth,
Mhm.
and violence escalates in Girard's view. His last book was called Battling to the End, and he talks about the escalation of runaway violence in a world where a lot of the restraining mechanisms that we had, the decay of institutions and law, the rule of law and taboos, as those things disappear, there's nothing left to restrain our violence. So Girard, as a Christian, certainly believed very strongly that the only way out of this, there was no sort of political top-down solution to prevent these things. It's a profoundly psychological and spiritual thing. And that at the end of the day, forgiveness is perhaps the only way out.
And the scapegoat is just you didn't. I mean,
I didn't touch on
okay,
the scapegoat,
okay, yeah.
but the scapegoat is in a community or in a society that lacks a shared model of the good, that lacks any sort of transcendent idea about what is to be pursued, is in what Girard would call a mimetic crisis, where there's just total confusion about who to even look to, who the proper and positive models are. And in these situations of crises, the thing that prevents a war of all against all, a Hobbesian war of all against all, is prevented by singling out a single individual to put all of the blame on. And
Or a group of individuals, right? I mean,
or a group of individuals, right?
like Al Qaeda or whatever, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And that unites people in shared opposition to that group. So it actually has a cathartic, uniting effect. And of course, the word scapegoat comes straight out of the Bible in Leviticus, where there was quite literally every year in Yom Kippur, a goat was, symbolically all the sins of the people were put on the head of this goat, and it was driven out by the community into the desert, right, to die. And the fact that all of the people would actually be involved in the process of driving that goat out into the desert is the most important part of the whole story, because the people were united in some shared act against the scapegoat to drive the scapegoat off. So in Greek, the scapegoat is called the pharmakon, pharmakos, right? The medicine, which is also the cure. I'm sorry, the poison, which is also the cure. Some person in the community, typically, thrown off the top of a cliff. On the movie Midsummer, if you've seen that horror film, literally just literally displays this happening to somebody thrown off the top of a cliff by a crowd. And that scapegoat unites people. And in Girard's view, what often happens is the scapegoat is then deified in some way. The scapegoat is seen to possess some magical power. Because think about it, the scapegoat magically solved the problem. It lowered the anxiety. It helped people unite. Caiaphas famously said this about Jesus, right? The scapegoat is seen to have some kind of magical property that it unites people that nobody else can, and in hindsight is viewed as having some kind of a godly power in some sense. So we have to be careful about who we make scapegoats, because the scapegoats are often elevated to some higher status later.
So one of the things I think is so sort of fascinating about the Girard stuff is it's so interdisciplinary insofar as it's like taking, because I talked about Fred Hirsch and positional goods and conspicuous consumption with Thorsten Veblen, but there are bits in here that echo sort of Carl Schmitt, tell me who your enemy is and I'll tell you who you are. And there's obviously a chunk of Freud in the sense of like the narcissism of small differences, right? And the way that status plays. You don't have narcissism of small differences in competition over goods. You only have narcissism of small differences in competition over status, right? That's why faculty lounges, are so riven with anger about who has a better parking spot, right? It's there's not actually a lack of resources. There's a lack of there's a contest of who has the higher status resource, and of course there's Nietzsche in here. I remember one of the first things I read about memetics got into this thing about how, I think it was an econ talk thing from a couple years ago where I can't remember the guy Russ had on, but about how fashion plays into all of this, insofar as if you want to show that you have the power or the self-assertion to reject the other the reigning group's thing, is you reject their sartorial insignia, right? So like the Silicon Valley guys completely reject the jacket and tie business suit stuff and go with the t-shirt, the $3,000 t-shirt as the symbol of their status. And that gets you back into the sort of the Thorsten Veblen thing, with the conspicuous consumption. And anyway, I bring it into real life, right? You wrote a book about how this stuff affects people in their day-to-day lives. How should people just going to work who aren't going to go read René Girard and don't want to get deep into literary exegesis on Shakespeare or whatever, how does this matter to the normies rather than the nerds on this podcast?
So I'm also a big fan of Murray Bowen, who's a family systems theorist, and the connection between him and Girard is he would say things like gossip are highly mimetic things.
Mm-hmm.
They sort of make an in-group and they make an out-group. And your reference to rejecting the idea of the other group. I mean, ideas are more fashionable than clothes are,
Mm-hmm.
especially now. And we see this move on both the right and the left. This kind of move to the extremes, like whoever can reject the thing that happened before us and say that that's lame and be more based or whatever you want to say.
Right. Rob Henderson has this book out. Yeah, it was on the podcast
Great
a couple
book.
months ago. Yeah, about where he sort of introduces this idea of luxury beliefs, which I think it's a great new phrase. I think it's actually a pretty old idea, but it's really well presented and updated, for people to grasp. It's like only people who come from very privileged backgrounds can believe some of the crap that college kids believe these days and on elite campuses. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, it's a great book, and I think just we've seen it with the woke and the anti-woke thing. I mean, how many more books are going to come out in the next couple of years with the word woke in the title or anti-woke in the title? I mean, come on, so this locks us into this, in my view, relatively exhausting, tiresome, rivalrous back and forth. And unfortunately, those books still do come out, and they still do very well. Some of them are not bad, but because it draws on the tribal energy of that, And absolutely, we need to be careful who we make our enemies because we become like them. But I think it's a huge drain on creativity and ingenuity, because we're looking to our model rather than looking to anything new. So it's not very generative when we're locked in these mimetic rivalries. The obsession with political rivals, the obsession with the political party, everything becomes derivative of what they do. We need to be careful about this in our personal lives too. I mean, I'm a professor at a university. I see this in academia all the time. Somehow putting shields up against the amount of information that we're consuming and how much we know, for me, is at least some huge help for that. There's often times when I'm in a situation. I remember when I went to NYU Stern undergrad business school, highly competitive. Everybody goes to work on Wall Street. And I remember I would walk into the building, and 3 hours later, I would leave completely depressed and exhausted and filled with static anxiety and all kinds of anxiety about what kind of job I was going to have, comparing myself to how smart I was relative to the other students. And then on the train back to Astoria, about halfway through that train ride, all of those concerns and anxieties that I had just seemed a little bit ridiculous.
Mhm.
And immediately the weight would start to lift off of me. That is a world which I name in the book. That's a world that I call Freshmanistan. It's like we're all freshmen again. It's like we're all freshmen in high school or freshmen in college. Not a very fun, I mean, in some senses it's fun, but in general, from an existential standpoint, everybody is in crisis mode. Everybody is trying to look to everybody else and form their identity. And it's really not a very fun place to live. And it seems like with social media, the entire world is turning into Freshmanistan, in my view, because we all know what everybody else is thinking and doing at all times. So being aware of it is helpful. Um, it's a helpful first step to realize, and maybe having a good spouse like I do, who's able to like pull me back when I'm getting too in rabbit holes with this stuff, to gain some perspective on it.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up because, like, getting back to the authenticity thing. Um, um, I'm I'm a conservative guy. I'm against what people call moral relativism, right? Whether people I don't know if you're aware of this, but sometimes people misuse terms. But sort of in the conventional sense, I'm against moral relativism and situational ethics and blah 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 blah. But I've really been coming around to the view that I don't know if it's the Girardian view per se, which is why I asked you earlier about the difference between authenticity and identity, is that I think to have a healthy, well-grounded life, you need multiple identities, right? There's some institutions where you're going to be a leader, and there are some institutions where you're going to be a follower, and there are going to be other institutions where you're going to be something in the middle, and there are going to be places where you're going to act differently with your if you're a guy, with your male friends than you would with your wife or your parents or your coworkers, and there's nothing hypocritical about that. That's actually authentic, because there are different aspects of you. I mean, I don't want to get into like Plato's chariot, but right there, if you have a team of horses that represent different parts of your personality, you're going to switch which horses are in the lead depending on the situation that you're in, and it's all still you. And I actually think that leads to, I know we're using authenticity as a dirty word here, but a truer form of authenticity, because you get to express the different aspects of your essentially diverse identity in ways that bring more fulfillment, right? I mean, anyway, it's just sort of where it keeps coming into my head in this conversation.
Yeah, I don't like the word authenticity because it's been abused. But certainly, yes, we relate to different groups of people in different ways. I relate to my best friends from college in a different way than I do to, the Twitter mutuals and stuff like that. So absolutely, but there is some continuity of self there, right? So there is,
Right.
I believe there is such a thing as a solid self, which is as opposed to the pseudo self. And the pseudo self is the kind of self that has to negotiate everything existentially into real time because there's nothing solid to stand on. And in a world where people don't have a solid self anymore, we're living in a world where there are more pseudo selves. And I think the pseudo self is more mimetic and more prone to be negotiating everything, even like very foundational moral stuff, like negotiating first principles every day on Twitter in real time.
Right.
That's a very dangerous place to be in. So when I say, I don't like the word authenticity, but I do believe we have an identity, and that we have a drive to be who we are. We have a name, we have a history, and I'm also coming from a very Christian perspective. So identity is important, and I'd mentioned earlier in the conversation that we have this simultaneous drive to differentiate ourselves and to belong. And I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We've got to be able to do both of those things.
Yeah, just to be clear, I agree with all of that. If the way I think about it is, I like the idea of the solid self versus the pseudo self. There are core parts of who you are in terms that you take with you everywhere you go, so that, if there was a secret camera watching me when I was with my guy friends from college, it's not like my wife wouldn't recognize that person, right?
Right.
I'm not talking about like being like Dexter and going off and being a serial killer, because that's
Right.
one aspect of my true self. That's not the point. But it does get at this Girardian point that that institutions, which institutions and their role is a big topic on this podcast, and in part because of the influence of you've all live in on me. But part of Girard's, as you know, part of Girard's point about religion is that religion doesn't cause violence. Religion, in effect, regulates violence or tries to channel it into, is productive not quite the right word, right? But it's a way to like limit violence rather than promote violence. And most of the institutions of civilization are means of trying to impose order and regulate human nature. And in an anti-institutional time, I think a lot of our problems stem from this romantic lie that no one has the right to try and regulate what I want or what I believe.
Right. So when some people refer to Girard as a very apocalyptic thinker, and by that they mean the things that channel ambition and energy into productive things, like liberal democratic capitalism, which is a relatively modern invention when you look at human history. When you look at institutions of law, when you look at norms, I mean, things like taboos, which have developed pretty naturally, as these things are tested and begin to crumble, we can very easily head back in the other direction. Right? It's this myth of progress that things just keep getting better because we're all so enlightened, Girard would say, is a lie. And when people refer to him as apocalyptic, they're referring to these things crumbling will make it so that we are losing the restraints that we have on this fundamental rivalrous and relatively violent part of our human nature. So absolutely, he would say, I mean, I go to Mass every Sunday, and I would say that's an opportunity for me to reflect on what human violence can do. So I look at the cross and make some kind of a self-sacrifice, right, and channel those desires into loving my wife and my neighbor. So yes, religion has caused a lot of violence in human history, but Girard would say that it's he would make a distinction between the sacred and religion. The sacred is responsible for violence because we have you would call it deviated transcendence. We seek transcendence in all of the wrong ways. Stoning a person would be a form of deviated transcendence. It somehow allows us to transcend the situation that we were in. We get rid of the bad guy. We've done it's a sacred act, right? Any act of violence, he would call it communal act of violence, is a sacred act. He would call capital punishment and some kind of a sacred act. It serves some kind of a sacred function in society. So he would say primitive religion or the sacred would be the way that he would categorize this, as opposed to the proper function of nonviolent religion, which would be to orient us away from violence, which involves renunciation, which involves forgiveness, which involves a turning away from some of those base instincts and channel that into more productive things. And the church has tried to do this for many years. It doesn't always work. The kind of idea of renouncing many things is a fundamental part of it. This is what monasticism was born out of a very, very corrupt world, where people tried to flee some of those base instincts.
Yeah, I mean, my last book, the core thesis is that human nature is corrupting, and that the failure of most institutions is attributable to too much indulgence of human nature, rather than remaining commitment to the things that restrain, channel, and exploit beneficially the aspects of human nature. Right? I mean, the example I always use is, from my dad. My dad always used to say the single most corrupting thing in business isn't money, it's friendship. And the point he would make is like, if someone called him out of blue and said, I'll give you $10,000 if you hire my kid, he said, get the hell out of here. But if his oldest friend called him and said, hey, Sid, my kid's had a really rough time. He really needs a fresh start. Could you do me this huge favor? We go way back. My dad was like, I'm not saying I'd automatically do it, but I'd think about it a lot harder because it's very difficult. And that's because we are wired to do favors for friends and family, for kin, for our tribe, for our platoon.
Nepotism.
Right. And I mean, in the church, the history of nepotism is really kind of fascinating. It means nephewism. And it was all because the church...
Popes and cardinals.
Yeah, the cardinals were betraying their first loyalty, which was supposed to be to the church, and instead rewarding either their nephews or their quote unquote nephews, with as if it was the church's stuff was theirs to give, like they were feudal lords that could just give away through, decree. But I want to get to this point. I want to read you this quote and see what you think about it, because I use it every now and then. I don't like crowds. I don't like populism. I don't like mobs. I don't like the aesthetics of it. I don't like the rhetoric from Obama. We are the ones we've been waiting for. I don't like MAGA rallies. I think the irreducible unit in American political culture is the individual who stands up to the mob, not the mob itself. And there's this great line from a minister, Eugene Peterson. He says, classically, there are three ways in which humans try to find transcendence or religious meaning, apart from God as revealed through the cross of Jesus, through the ecstasy of alcohol and drugs, through the ecstasy of recreational sex, and through the ecstasy of crowds. Church leaders frequently warn against the drugs and the sex, but at least in America, almost never against the crowds. And I think a huge part of our politics, our problem in our politics, is people want this transcendence of crowds. They want to feel like they're part. I mean, it's fun to be in a mob, right? We saw with the George Floyd stuff. These kids were having fun toppling statues, so much fun that they didn't care that they were toppling statues of abolitionists. They just saw, oh, white dude made a stone, I'll tear him down. And the zealotry of the crowd, which is this mimetic process, right, terrifies me. I dislike it. And I think the problem with social media is it is a digital simulacrum of mob mentality in a lot of ways.
I couldn't agree more. And this is kind of the Durkheim effervescence.
Right.
It feels good. It feels good. And I think for many people, it is their closest thing that they've experienced to some form of spiritual transcendence. I also dislike crowds. We both live in Washington, D.C. I mean, you couldn't get me to show up to a march or a rally for the thing something that I really, really, really loved. I mean, if there was a 1 million man march for tomahawk steaks on the Washington, D.C. mall, I still don't think I would show up.
Yeah.
I don't think I would want to. It'd freak me out. I'd be like, all right, great. I get to meet a lot of other guys that like to grill and like to eat steak. You'd think I'll make a bunch of friends. I wouldn't do it, right? It would feel like a cult.
Yeah.
And I would because we very easily lose ourselves in crowds. And believe me, I'm first to raise my hand. I found myself saying and doing things in crowds that if I had any intentionality and self-possession, I would not have done. I spent a lot of my life learning that lesson the hard way. So I do think that's true. I've had a taste of other, forms of transcendence that make the crowd type stuff. I see it for what it is. So
We
I
should
don't
say
know.
it's not always unhealthy, right? Sports, like guys at a Packers game going crazy all together, doing the wave. It seems to me that's a healthy outlet
I think it
for,
serves a very important purpose.
yeah,
I feel like if the NFL was abolished tomorrow, that I don't know what would happen in this country on
yeah, yeah,
Sundays,
yeah.
right? In the
I
fall,
think that's
right?
right. I mean,
Big
it can
problem.
creep me out personally, but I think it's understandable, human, and and harmless as an outlet and as a source of social solidarity in a completely non-threatening place. But there's still something about it that makes me uneasy at times.
Sure, I agree, and I wonder if the irreducible unit in society is not the individual but the family, right? Because the family is how we learn to
Yeah.
be together, and when with family, I mean all the numbers, I mean the family life is absolutely crumbling. So what does that say about our ability to live together and respect differences? I mean, I think you and I both have families. I mean, you just learn a lot of lessons in the family. Um, it's true. The church never talks about the crowd. I don't know why. There's a couple of rare exceptions. I think we should be talking a lot more about crowd dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
The next book I'm writing is called The One in the 99 because I don't have the answer to that question, but I'm trying to figure it out, and that's why I write a book is to try to figure shit out.
Yes. So
Yeah.
let me ask you this, because this is sort of a remnant bingo card thing you just brought up. I agree with you entirely that the irreducible unit of society is the family. I said the irreducible unit of the political culture is the individual, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in what Friedrich Hayek would call the macrocosm and microcosm, or what the German social scientists could call the Gesellschaft and the Gemeinschaft, right? So, like in the family and the small association, the small community, what Dunbar's number is like 150 people, something like that. It's all about family and extended family and de facto family and all that kind of stuff. But in order to regulate violence and ensure prosperity in the Gesellschaft, in the extended order of liberty, where you got to deal with strangers, the individual unit has to be the irreducible unit has to be the individual for all sorts of, just I think, procedural reasons, right? And the market economy does not work as a system of exchange between families. It's got to work as a system of exchange between a buyer and a seller, and contracts have to be written between individuals. If you had a contract between families, you're basically, I'm making my kid beholden to something I signed. That's unfair. That's unjust. That's illiberal. But in terms of creating a healthy culture and a healthy society and healthy human beings, family is the essence of what generates a healthy society.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up the market economy, which is a great example of that. I mean, I plan to sell my house, and I don't necessarily know who I'm going to sell it to. I might not know anything about the person that buys it. I won't know if he's a Republican or a Democrat. I won't know if he's a good person necessarily.
Right.
If he pays the price, I'll take his money, and like that makes this whole thing work. So absolutely, that's a good distinction to make. This is maybe a question that I'm asking you with just kind of your broader sort of political knowledge. Girard would say that institutions work by doing a little bit of violence to prevent more violence from happening.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the image of the pyramid, which is a carefully constructed set of stones, which is a symbol of the more primitive version, which is a pile of rocks from a ritual stoning. The pyramid represents institutions, in other words. So the pyramid is representative of institutions, and what's underneath every pyramid? A body, right? There's been some kind of a founding murder, or there's some sacred center over which the pyramid was built, a king,
Mm-hmm.
some kind of a ritual sacrifice. So he uses the pyramid as the next step of evolution after ritual stonings. Most parts of the world, there are no more ritual stonings, but we build institutions, we build pyramids, And in some sense, there's some violence at the heart of them. I mean, at a most basic level, somebody breaks the law, right? You somehow put them in jail, some form of violence to prevent greater violence. Does that general Girardian point sort of resonate with?
Well, yes, no.
Yeah.
If I want to understand it more, so is it metaphorical in the sense that, because I mean, you could say basically America was founded with a bloody revolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was refounded with a bloody civil war. The new institutions, like Civil War amendments, right? They come out of violent conflict. The post World War II international order comes out of World War II. Mansur Olson has this thing about the only way to cut through, the accumulated red tape and sclerosis of advanced democracies is a devastating war, and you can mean like that. But do I think that like the Shriners or the Boy Scouts are about institutionalized violence? Abuse scandals notwithstanding, I don't necessarily see that. So I guess I'm just asking you to understand it more.
Yeah, so that's a good example. I think that it's not. He doesn't mean it metaphorically. He means that behind every institution which presents itself as 100% benevolent, violence might be too strong of a word to use here. It necessarily has to disappoint people. It has to disillusion people. It has to have sort of like rules. It has to have, let's even call bureaucracy violence in some cases, right?
Coercion, right?
Coercion. It has to restrain desires.
Mm-hmm.
It has to channel the rivalries in certain ways. I would argue that maybe even the Boy Scouts do that. So I think, let me walk that back a little bit and sort of define, maybe not even use the word violence, but they serve a function that is, let's just say, in some sense, unnatural.
Absolutely, I 100%, 110% agree with that. For starters, and so this is old hat for some listeners, but my colleague, you at AEI, Yuval Levin, in this wonderful book Fractured Republic, he writes about institutions, and he basically says it's a very, I mean, I don't think he knows a lot of Girard stuff. At least the last time I talked to him about it, he didn't. But there's a mimetic aspect to it, right? He says when you think about the proper functioning of an institution, it's a mold. It's a thing that creates a certain character. And part of creating a character is shaping desires of a character, right? And so the classic example would be the Marine Corps. You go in a damn hippie, you come out a Marine, right? It shapes who you are. Same thing with the Boy Scouts. You go in a wild, undisciplined little kid, you come out a kid who's helping little old ladies cross the street. And that's how properly functioning institutions work. Obviously, you can see how it would work with religion. But Yuval's point is that the problem we have in modern culture today is that we no longer see institutions as molds. We see them as platforms that we can perform upon, that we exploit the prominence and status of our institutions for our own personal self-aggrandizement, right? And so whatever you think of Colin Kaepernick and that whole controversy, that's not the point. He was using the NFL as a platform for his stuff. Look at me. And the only reason you're looking at him is because he's in the NFL, right? And it's been the bane of a lot of journalistic institutions where people use their Twitter feeds or their cable profiles and they exploit their association with the New York Times, the Washington Post, whatever, for their own cult of personality, right? Rather than like bend themselves to the needs of the institution, they use the institution as a platform or as leverage to show off. And so I that's Yuval's argument. Part of what I would add to that is that for an institution to have internal coherence and do its job, it has to be sticky. There has to be a reason why you're in this institution and not some other institution. And that means it has to be able to impose rules and expectations on members of the institution. Now, I'm a believer in liberal democracy, right? So, like, you have to have, to some extent, the right of exit, right? So, like, even a Marine can quit the Marines. It's
painful.
There are penalties for it, but once he's done with his service, he can definitely he just can just leave, right? But there's a contractual thing there. But most other institutions, there's not even that. Like, but if you join the Catholic Church, it's incumbent upon you to follow the rules of the Catholic Church, and um, uh, so to me, I think one of the really telling things, and maybe there's a role of memetics in this, is that the institutions that have weathered the crisis of institutions the last 20 years the best have been the ones which expect the most of their members. The ones that expect the least of their members just dissipate, right? So for a long time, I don't know what the current numbers are, but for a long time, the Marines were the only ones to hit their recruitment goals. Because for people who say, I want to commit myself to this kind of life, they go all in, and so they want to do the one that's hardest, right? They don't want to just, skate by kind of thing. Similarly, the branch of Judaism that is thriving and growing are the branches, I should say, are the most observant, the most orthodox, the ones that expect the most of their adherents. The ones that, there's a certain branch of Reform Judaism that is sort of like utilitarianism. It's one of the last exits before atheism. And those things don't ask much of you. And so you don't feel required to give much to them, and they don't actually end up shaping you very much.
I mean, well, and that's been, in my view as a Catholic, that's been the debacle in the Catholic Church since the 60s and the 70s, right? Just let's ask less and less of people. And I'm speaking as somebody who walked away from my entrepreneurial life to enter seminary for 5 years in my late 20s. And a young man wants to make heroic sacrifices.
Right.
And I want the institution to ask a lot of me. I don't want to go into it and pick and choose what I like and what I don't like. That's not why you join the institution or the church in this case. So that makes a ton of sense to me. And I can't help but think of universities too.
Yeah.
And what's happened to universities. So if you're a 17 or 18-year-old kid and you're trying to choose a university to go to, you have a choice to make. And I think how you think of the institution shapes the one that you might want to join. You can either join one where you just get the fancy credentials and have a party for 4 years and graduate and get to say that you've got, Harvard or whatever on your resume and use it as a thing to perform on, like you and Yuval are saying. Or you can choose the one that you think will shape you into the adult that you would like to be, right? Where you're actually going to undergo a rite of passage. You accept the norms of the university. So, maybe that means not setting up a tent on campus, whatever. And you accept that, and you're all in because you're accepting that the benefits that you're going to get by adhering to that process are going to be worth the cost that you pay to be part of the institution and to follow the rules.
Yeah. I keep thinking about the freak out at Yale. It's almost like 10 years ago now. So like
Christakis thing.
Yeah. And I just remember there was something, it was either at Yale or Harvard, but there was this vignette from this thing where one of the professors says, essentially, goes sort of, was Socratic, come, let us reason together. Let's debate these things. And this young female student says, I don't want to debate anything. I want you to respect my pain or something like that. And I'm butchering the quote, but that's the idea. And there is this thing on college campuses that I think the October 7th protest stuff is a natural outflow of, which is that, and it goes back to the Rousseauian lie, is that there's almost this idea that the professors have nothing to teach. The institutions have nothing to offer these kids except a permission structure to indulge their conception of their conception of personal authenticity, which is just like the antithesis of what education is supposed to be about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you start college, you don't know what you don't know,
Right.
right? So just to give them a carte blanche, oh, this is whatever you want to learn about, whatever weird. Yeah, I think a student going into it, understanding that, trusting the institution, there has to be trust in the institution that they're going to teach me what I need to know to be a healthy, happy adult. I think I want to mention this because I think what you're talking about on Yale was Nicholas Christakis over the Halloween stuff.
Yeah,
That
I mean, it was
probably
around
10
that
or 12
time. I
years
just
ago.
don't remember it was that exact incident.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I noticed he said something really interesting about how he interacted with the crowd. And he was surrounded, I've seen that video, surrounded by Yale students. And he said, in the midst of that crowd, which he felt at a certain point, he was a little nervous.
Mhm.
He said, I would look the student in the face and I would ask them what their name was, as a tactic to bring them back to themselves,
Yeah.
right? To remember that they had moral responsibility and to not just be absorbed into the crowd. And that really hit me,
Yeah.
as a way, oh, my name's Luke, and I actually have personal responsibility for what happens to this man. There's always an element of the anonymous in the crowd where you can just absolve yourself of responsibility because it's the crowd that did it, not me. Now, I've heard, I don't know if it's a myth or not, but I've heard that for rifle squads and executions, nobody really knows if they were the one that had the blank or the real bullet in
Right.
there, so they never have to deal with that. And it's kind of the way that the pharmacos is pushed off the cliff. It's not any one particular person that actually pushed them off. The entire crowd backed them off the cliff, right? So no one particular person actually had the moral responsibility of doing that. So I thought there was an important lesson in there in the way that Christakis handled that.
So it's interesting you bring that up. So like, because anonymity, I think, is really dangerous, and so this is pre-Twitter, right? So this is about 22, 25 years ago when I first started writing for National Review, back in the day, in part because I have the Jewiest names short of Shlomo Abramowitz, out there. I would get a lot of anti-Semitic stuff, and by email, and snail mail, but mostly by email, and the ideological distribution of it doesn't really matter or anything like that. And because I was young and it was new and all that kind of stuff, I would respond to a lot of these things, which is generally stupid. And and I would say things sort of like, shame on you, or one of my favorite things to say is God is watching you. And often they just respond with more asinine, Jews in an ashtray jokes or whatever. But I would say it was really interesting in the first couple years that this would happen. I would say 1 in 10, 1 in 20 would respond by saying, "Oh my God, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I wasn't even thinking you would ever read that. Or I was drunk and I just want to get stuff off my chest, and I just picked on you, and I'm really embarrassed, and I don't know what I was thinking, and I really didn't think you were going to read it." And I forgave him, at least in terms of an email, but like, I don't want to party with any of them. But that ability to sort of do a note in a bottle and throw it out anonymously into the world allows people to indulge sort of their worst, most uninhibited, unmolded parts of their personalities. And I think that, to fast forward to today, the thing that disturbs me the most about, to go back to your point about the throwing the first stone, is that Twitter gives people permission to be parts of, or social media gives people permission to be parts of mobs, because our brain is wired so that we think, a dozen people is a group, 100 people is a community, and 1,000 people is a movement. And so you get these groups of people, these sort of internet flash mobs, doing and saying the most hateful, terrible things, and they feel okay with it because they didn't throw the first stone and they're part of the group. And the group gives them permission to say, I'm doing it because this is a legitimate thing to do because the group is doing it.
Yeah. And I don't know where you stand on pseudo-anonymous and anonymous accounts on social media, but that certainly fuels it too. It just makes it that much easier. I don't know if those emails you were receiving had names attached to them or not.
Sometimes did, sometimes didn't,
Yeah.
often not,
Yeah. It seems like that makes a difference. And I understand the case for anonymity related to free speech. I get it. I'm kind of a both and guy on this issue. I understand why that's important, but I also I think it's incredibly dangerous to be able to say things with never having to be held to account as an individual.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, we don't have to get deep in the weeds on this, but and some of my free speech absolutist friends get mad at me when I talk about this. I personally think that free speech was supposed to be primarily about politics, and so I'm kind of an absolutist about political speech, journalism, commentary about our political leaders, that kind of stuff. But I just don't think the founding fathers envisioned, say, pornography to be covered by the First Amendment the way it is now. I'm not saying it's not covered by the First Amendment, but like the level of the tiers of scrutiny for it should be tighter, kind of thing. And similarly, the performative stuff that clearly has nothing to do with politics whatsoever, making them all grand philosophical First Amendment things kind of sometimes leaves me cold, which doesn't mean I'm in favor of censoring all of them. I think there's more room to talk about how privately owned platforms can do whatever the hell they want in terms of policing the kind of speech that's on them. And but I think, to get back to your point or our point, in some ways that whole conversation misses the element of the responsibility of normal people not to be jackasses, right? I mean, we got a leadership problem in this country. We got a followership problem in this country too, because normal everyday people are buying into a lot of these ideas that self-restraint is as illegitimate a concept as is external restraint.
Yeah, and that debate. I mean, if I'm the president of a university or the owner of a company, and I have a code of conduct that says "Don't be a jackass" in so many words, don't have your name attached to my institution or this company, and to be out there saying X, Y, and Z. The military does this, right? I mean, it's like to violate that expectation and then to cry free speech, I think is just ridiculous. I mean, the lines have just become so blurred on that issue. What happened to basic expectations and norms around behavior, and to always default back to that seems to be a little tiresome.
Yeah, I mean, like, I believe in honor codes, right? So at Catholic University, you're a professor. I assume you have the free speech right to say in class, I think we should gas all the Jews, or we should wipe out the Muslims, or we should expel all the Mexicans, whatever. You have the free speech right to say those things. If I were the president of the university and if you said those things, I'd still try to fire you.
Right.
Because it's not the kind of community that you want to have. And like the way and if you're talking about molding character, part of it is molding the kind of things that are permissible to say in an institution. Now, if it was a public institution, there are different rules and yada, 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 but the principle is there.
But if that situation happened, there would be some very divisive political debate about how the president was a tyrant and didn't respect free speech.
Right.
Probably, no matter what it was,
right.
No matter what I said.
Yeah. All right, so we got to close, but circling back on the Girard part of it. So, like, I'm a dork, right? I read a lot of philosophy in college. I read a lot more Foucault than I did about the Federalist Papers. I've been doing intellectual eggheadery for a long, middlebrow intellectual eggheadery for a long time, basically a quarter century now. And I don't claim to be some sort of deep scholar on political philosophy or on philosophy in general, but it's weird to me that a guy like Girard I had not heard of him until I want to say 5 years ago, something like that, give or take. Why is that? I mean, like, where is it? And I should be clear. I've asked my friends like 5 years ago, do you know anything about this guy? Because I'd heard about the Peter Thiel thing, and he's this hot thing, and blah, 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 blah. And a lot of them hadn't, and they were even more political philosophy nerds than I am. What happened in the last decade that he's kind of broken through, or am I just part of a bubble that didn't realize that he was a big deal all along?
Well, there's a great book written about Girard called "Wanting the Power of Medic." No, I'm kidding. Hopefully that was part of the reason in the last 5 years he's broken through. I will say, even in Girard's lifetime, he wasn't run out of academia. He retired from Stanford, died in 2015. But because of some of his religious convictions, he was not welcomed. And even today at Stanford, I just went to a Girard event at Stanford, his university, where he was in an endowed chair for over 20 years. And we're not welcomed on campus to talk about Girard. We got to do something separately with the private foundation to even have a little seminar. It's very bizarre. He was not welcomed in his own institution. I think a lot of that has to do with the way that his ideas challenged the zeitgeist of the day. You know, he was sort of not in the 80s and the 90s. He was already challenging a lot of the ideas that lied behind the direction that Stanford and many of these academic institutions were moving in, and he paid a cost for that career-wise.
And you think it's primarily the religion part of it?
I think that that has a lot to do with it. I don't think that's the only reason. I think he's hard to read.
Well, but he can't hold that
translators. He can't hold that against a guy who's French. Yeah. I do think academics should write books that people can understand, for the most part. Well, at least we need more of them. So he's not easy to understand. It's taken a while for him to become appreciated. There's been lots of people that have contributed to making his work more accessible, many, many people. But I do think that we hit a moment with the election of Trump, is right around the time that I think people started to take more of an interest in Girard's work, because we were seeing the mimetic dynamics like we haven't seen before. And people started to look to this thinker to try to understand what in the heck was going on psychologically in the country. So I don't think anybody in France is having these kinds of conversations about Girard. It's really America's leading the charge on this stuff, right? Because of what's been happening in the country.
Yeah, I mean, like, Kevin Williamson, a friend of mine, was just in Scotland, and they did a tour of Adam Smith's hometown, and the tour guide was like, "Yeah, I don't really know much about this guy." It's like, I think that's
no prophet is welcome in his hometown.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And so, just as on a sort of, so I understand it, what does? I'm not trying to get you in any trouble with your Girardians. Look, I spent so much time living among Straussians. I know how these things sometimes work, but what is the relationship between, like, what does Peter Thiel get out of Girard? Like, why does he? I mean, I know he's a big fan and he was a student and all of that, but like, where is the overlap of the sort of Thiel's larger projects or stuff in the Venn diagram between him and Girard? Like, is it just like he thinks he's really interesting, or does it influence Trumpian politics in a way that I'm still grappling to understand?
You know, at the risk of being a little reductionistic here, I mean, I think there's kind of a very Socratic, you know, the crowd is usually wrong. What do you believe is true that almost nobody else thinks is true on Thiel's side? I mean, that applies to his work as an investor, as an entrepreneur, not just politics. So this kind of contrarianism, I think, I think contrarians are naturally attracted to Girard, but one has to be careful with that, because being a contrarian, I don't like that word. I know that Peter doesn't like that word either. Can often just mean putting a minus sign in front of what the crowd says and thinking yourself very independent, right? Where the goal is really to hopefully think for yourself. I think there's a lot of people interested in Girard are also interested in Strauss, you know, for some reason, at least in that crowd. So there is this general vibe of there are. I look. I'm the first to be critical of Girard, and I think it can lead to a kind of sort of Gnostic. I know things about human psychology and human behavior that nobody else knows, and therefore, I'm able to abstract myself from these things, and that's a very dangerous thing to believe. Because it means that you think that you're abstracted from the very thing that you're accusing everybody else of being, which is a mimetic creature, perhaps a religious creature who has this desire and impulse to imitate and for the sacred. So, but I do think that, and I think it's fashionable. I think that Girard would laugh at knowing that he's becoming somewhat fashionable right now, but I do think he provides a powerful framework for understanding the tribal dynamics. And the acceleration of I think cancel culture was a great example of this, the acceleration of trying to use violence to drive out violence, which is, if we can just get rid of this person, then everything will be great again. And in the process of doing that, that is itself a violent act. And that is, Girard warned against that his entire life. And I think he's got a really important thing to say to us with that. He should never be used to actually, I think Girard's the reason he's important to me is a profoundly spiritual reason. And it goes back to the conversation we had about forgiveness earlier in this podcast.
Yeah. No, I mean, I find his explanation of Jesus and forgiving. I mean, I know the story of Jesus and forgiveness generally, but his exploration of it I find very compelling, and very interesting. And I think you make a very good point, which I just think is worth underscoring, which is that contrarianness for its own sake, first of all, can be one of the great sources of asininity in life. And it can also be one of the best examples of conformity, right? And there's a whole sort of Monty Python, we're all individuals kind of thing that goes into a lot of the sort of studied nonconformity that all your friends are into in the exact same way, which would be sort of a Girardian point. You touch on it. I'll just you can have the last word on this. Your point about where you would criticize Girard, that's sort of where that's sort of my problem with it, is that it's kind of like that scene in The Matrix where the guy says, "I don't even see the code anymore," right? Like I've hacked the system, kind of thing. And sometimes when I read, not so much Girard, but people who talk about him and people who write about him, or people who use and abuse him, I do think he gets used and abused the way like Nietzsche gets used and abused. You get this kind of sense that like it's all a game, and it can be a kind of morally flattening thing, where if you reduce everything simply to modalities of fashion and joining and rejection and that kind of stuff, without actually looking at the substance that someone is signing up for or that is rejecting, and realizing that there are, like Christianity is different than softball, and joining the softball league does not bring with it nearly the same sorts of social importance, psychological importance, personal, spiritual importance, all these kinds of things, than joining a church. But it's sort of like what the Marxists do, by reducing everything down to a process, you lose you flatten the topography of life to 2 dimensions, when it's really 3 dimensions, and that some mountain peaks are much higher than others and more important than others. And so I find it useful as a way to thinking about things, but I don't find it to be, as a non-Christian, I don't find it to be necessarily seductive as a modus vivendi kind of thing. It's like this is my I'm a Girardian now. I think it's a useful mode of analysis, and it's some interesting literary stuff. But that's sort of where I get out of the cab. Does that make sense? Is that fair?
It makes sense, and I think I've experienced the same thing. I have a firm belief that we, and I just say that broadly with the amount of content out there, but this is certainly true in Girard circles that I've been in for the last 5 years. There's a tendency to just over intellectualize absolutely everything and get in these intellectual pissing contests, where I always have one tidbit of information that maybe you don't have, and I think that Girard can over intellectualize even Christianity itself.
Mhm.
Right, which is sort of a danger even to Christians that come at this. You can sort of interpret the entire Bible in a Girardian lens, and it opens up this whole new world. And at the end of the day, I think there are some things that not everything is really complex and hard to understand. There are some things that are easy to understand but hard to do, like forgiving somebody that I don't like or somebody that's wrong, that's really offended me. That's really not a Girardian thing.
Yeah.
That's just a very human thing. And I kind of always come back to that. I think with any thinker, I don't care who it is, elevating them to the status of an idol and using them to interpret absolutely everything that happens in the world is a big problem. And I would say, just to conclude, Girard, his work, you could reduce it to saying that he was fascinated by how people make idols, how humans make idols. And one of his best friends, Gil Bailey, told me on a park bench in Northern California, René Girard could remove an idol from another man's eye as if it was an act of reverence, including his own. And he himself would not want his theory, or certainly himself, to be thought of in some kind of a totalitarianizing way to understand the entire world. He's been a thinker that's been extraordinarily influential for me, especially in seeing, he called himself a political atheist near the end of his life. And all he simply meant by that is that, humans tend to make idols of parties, of figures, of people, even of thinkers and ideas. And he used that phrase, which I like quite a bit, as just a rejection of a politics of idols completely.
All right. Luke Burgis, author of Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. Is that?
That's right.
At Catholic University. Thank you so much for doing this, and hope you come back sometime.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it, Jonah.